1607, there was an attempt to enslave English in England, and there's a rebellion, and they fight and they beat it back, and they establish some common law principles. And he talks about other reasons why they didn't persist in that because of the cost-benefit analysis, which he goes into. Allen is a very trained economist. I said he was a coal miner and stuff. He comes to New York. He teaches at the Jefferson School, which was a Communist Party school for many. He leaves the Communist Party, but he teaches economics there, Marxist economics. He teaches the Labor Research Association. Brilliant. He understands the economics, right, really well. Next. Here's a key thing. So what happens 1563 in England, the law is passed, and this is the labor law of England for the next 200 plus years, the Statute of Artificers. And basically two key aspects of it for our purpose right here. There would be no slavery, and laborers were to be paid wages. This is what we call the rights of an Englishman, if you will, right? This is, if you will. And so that's the law of the land of England who's coming to Virginia. This is their law, and the people who come are English. This is what they, all right. So by 1607, the conditions had ripened, and there's some colonization efforts shown. All right. Allen analyzes and discusses, I think people will find this, people interested in history elsewhere in the Americas, situations in different parts of America, particularly the Euro-Indian relations, and then he turns to Virginia. He points out a few key aspects about Virginia. It's a continental colony, not an insular one. So that means there's routes of escape unless you set up a system of social control that can contain. There's little significant stratification, particularly in Virginia, the area around Jamestown. The Native Americans living there are the Powhatan, right? And they're not a very stratified society, and it's a low population density. This is not going to serve the labor needs of the English, right? But the Powhatan were well provisioned, and for the first decade or two, they actually had the preponderance of force in terms of the Virginia colony. And this comes up, and some of this stuff I find striking too. Allen makes some important points on why the European powers didn't go deep into Africa, and it's because the Africans had the preponderance of force on the continent, for serious efforts to go in and move in, right? But the Native American population around Jamestown could not be surrounded, could not be exterminated, could not be brought under that degree of administrative control. Sean? Virginia Company charter is set up in 1606, and the members of the Virginia Company shall have all liberties, franchise, all the rights of an Englishman, quote again, if you will. There's a quantitative change in labor relations in 1622, right? Statute of Artificers says that wages will be paid and all labor is free. Throw that out. 1622. At the beginning of 1622, most of the laborers were tenants at half. They were producing tobacco. That was the crop. After 1616, tobacco was the crop in Virginia, right? Producing tobacco, you're working on an estate, a plantation. You work, you keep half of what you produce, right? That's the main form, but there's also wage labor, right? By the spring of 1623, what's going on is a massive reduction of tenants to servants, to bond servants, to chattel bond servants, people who could be bought and sold. And this is being done primarily on European Americans, because the first Africans only come in 1619. There's not that many yet, right? Not because of that, but I'm just saying it's the European Americans. All right, here's the key date. We got the anniversary coming up in another month and a half. 22 March 1622. On that day, the Powhatan Indians arise under their chief, and fearing the English would dispossess them, mounted what was to be, in relative terms, the strongest effort ever made to halt the Anglo-American occupation of Indian lands. First day, they wipe out 1/3 of the colony. One day, right? Within the next year, more would die from privation. Of the survivors, 2/3 were not fit for work, Sean. So what happens in the aftermath of this attack, and this is pre-Naomi Klein, all this shock doctrine, right? In the aftermath of the attack, and concerned about additional attack, the colony authorities forbade planting of corn. That's what the people were eating. That was the main crop, right? Corn, and near dwellings. So you couldn't even grow food to eat. You weren't, the perimeter was constricted. You couldn't go out because they were fearful of Native American attack. Half the landholders were dead. Corn supplies were limited. The price of corn goes up 8-fold in 1 year. The value of their labor for tobacco goes down. They're totally vulnerable, a laboring population. Sean. For the elite, the colony elite embarked on a scheme whereby tenants and workers were reduced to unpaid long-term bond laborers, right? They're imposing chattel bondage on these primarily European Americans towards the end of 1622 and thereafter. The laboring class is dependent on the bourgeoisie. They're compelled to submit. By the spring of 1622, contracts were appearing containing unprecedented provisions allowing the employer to dispose of the servants to the employer's heirs and assigns. They are now chattel. They can be bought, sold, passed on, right? Go on. Allen refers to this as the massacre of the tenantry. Sean? It's a qualitative break from English labor law. When you hear your history today, they talk about indentured servants, it's euphemisms. Europeans different than African, it's all code words, a lot of this stuff. The break from the statute of artificers, it's a qualitative break. This is not any carryover from English labor law. It's not a feudal carryover. Under feudalism, there's a two-way bondage. The serf and the lord each had obligations together. Here it's a one-way bondage. You got no say. You can be bought and sold. It's being imposed as custom of the country. That's the phrase in the records. These aren't indentures. These aren't people willingly signing, put me, signing in London, put me in bond servitude. And it's being imposed in Virginia. And it's not apprenticeship, which are some of the rationales that historians have used. Here's some of the stats. Of the 92,000 European immigrants brought to Virginia between 1607 and 82, more than 3/4 were chattel bond laborers. Not the history we've been taught necessarily, right? 1676, Governor William Berkeley estimated 1,500 a year, English, few Scots, and few Irish. Such recruitment was generally coercive. Few were wholehearted volunteers. Kidnappings, ordinary convicts, still others prisoners taken in rebellion and exiled. I saw statistics yesterday, what they call the Irish slave trade, which went primarily to the Caribbean, but also up here, 300,000 in a 10-year period, right? Some of the numbers are staggering, right? Come on, Sean. Oh, you did. Thank you. Okay, now this is important, and you see this in Lerone Bennett, and Allen elaborates on this. Very important. In this 17th century, particularly mid-17th century, the early years, right? Conditions for African-American, European American laborers and chattel bond servants were very similar. Through 1676, and at that time, the time of Bacon's Rebellion, 3/4 of the bond servants were still European Americans, right? In fact, the conditions were very hard. I'm not saying this was a Garden of Eden, right, or your paradise or whatever. They didn't survive their first year, many of them, right, particularly in the early years. But again, 17th century, most of the plantation laborers were chattel bond servants. Sean? Status of African Americans. Again, this is not the Kunta Kinte version of history where Kunta Kinte comes and encounters a full-blown system. 17th century Virginia was very different. In 17th century Virginia, African Americans, not all, right, but not all English either, right, exercised marriage rights, exhibited social mobility, some had significant landholding, some were owners of European American bond laborers. They manifested many forms of resistance. Some voted, they had voting rights, right? Come on. 17th century, the record makes clear, and this is how Allen sums up based on going through all those primary records. The relative social status of African Americans and European Americans at that time can be determined to have been indeterminate. It was being fought out, and it wasn't white against black, because there was no white yet, right? There were other factors in the class struggle, and the issue of slavery and freedom was being fought out. Sean, next. Here's an example, and this is a very important one, particularly people interested in family history, women's history, so much, and so key to the system that winds up getting developed. This is the case of Elizabeth Key. And this is another form. Allen goes page after page of the various forms of resistance. Running away, fighting, going to court, all the different ways, that people chose to resist and decided to resist. Elizabeth Key was a child of a European American father and an African American mother. She was scheduled to complete her term of service. when the estate she was bonded to sought to impose lifetime bond servitude. Now, there were these efforts by the ruling class to try and impose bond servitude, to try and lengthen the servitude of people, to try and impose bond servitude. But this contradicted the English common law principle, partus sequitur patrum, forgive my Latin. The condition of the child was the condition of the father. That's the law in England. This is still an English colony. She goes to court, Elizabeth Key, and she argues two things. Sean? She argues that on the basis of traditional principle that her Christian baptism and rearing barred her from being held as a slave. We have some precedent for that in the law and just in general, not so much in the law, but in the principle it was upheld often. And the common law principle that the social status of the child followed that of the father. That's her argument in court. And she prevails. She wins. 6 years later, they got to change that. They're moving in a different direction. Because the implications are, well, they change it and they take a different course and they say no. They, not in her case, but in a different case, they establish the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, descent through the mother. Because this means all of those women, those chattel bond servant women who are taken advantage of by men, right? Their children will be chattel bond servants, right? And this is what the system needs, right? But that's not the way it was first. So there's people like historians like Gutman and people like this write about the history of the African American family. They start in 1790 and stuff. This is so significant because it's a qualitative change, right? And people, this Elizabeth Key case I think is very important. Status of African Americans. So what Allen's arguing, the white race system of racial oppression did not and could not have existed in the 17th century. He bases it on the following facts. Class solidarity, which we're going to get into. The absence of an all-class coalition of European Americans, tremendous class differences, right? Lack of substantial intermediate stratum. Sean? The white race did not exist. The attitude of laboring class Europeans stood in sharp contrast to the plantation bourgeoisie. He emphasizes the invention of the white race cannot be ascribed to demands by European American laboring people for privileges. It's not coming from below, right? Sean? All right. Then he talks about social factors that lead up to Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. Price of tobacco drops in 1660. Conditions really get bad. There's no intermediate social control stratum. There's oppressive conditions, and there's no white worker component functioning. Sean, next. So the statistics at the time of Bacon's Rebellion, roughly 8,000 bond servants, 6,000 European American, 2,000 African Americans. There would be a continuous influx of European Americans until the end of the century, European Americans coming as bond laborers primarily. African bond laborers were imported, but still there's not the big turn. The Royal African Company is not even set up until the 1670s, right? So it's not like the big influx of Africans are coming. Come on, Sean. That is about the Africans in the 1672 Royal African Company established. Come on. Here's Bacon's Rebellion. This is the big one that Allen focuses on. There had been 10 preliminary bond servant and laboring class rebellions leading up to it in that period from 1660. It began in 1676 as a difference between the elite and the sub-elite. Basically, in Virginia, the elite planters liked things the way they were. They're the elite. They're fine with the way things are. The sub-elite were the planters on the make. They wanted to start building big plantations, so they wanted to push further. That meant pushing against the Native Americans who were on the perimeter, right? And so it starts out as an elite, sub-elite struggle over Indian policy. But it so often happens when the elite and the sub-elite go into conflict, right? People at the bottom of society get involved, right? And they take it in a different direction. So it's the second Civil War stage of Bacon's Rebellion. The rebels, European American, African American, rise up. They besiege the capital. They take control. They burn Jamestown. They kick the governor across the bay. And they control much of the land for months, right? According to Governor Berkeley, 6/7 of the people are poor, discontented, and armed, right? This is what social control was a serious problem in 1676 Virginia. Go on. Go on. We've been through this, all right. Here's when Bacon's rebellion is finally put down, there's this account which I showed you early in the session of Thomas Grantham, Grantham's account again here: 400 English and Negroes in arms. You have European Americans and African Americans fighting together for freedom from bondage. You won't see that for the next 300 years.